Welcome to Dialogue Podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Sebastian, and on this here podcast, I kill the small talk with the leading voices in crime, culture, and justice. I'm guessing that many of you have heard the phrase coined by a little true crime podcast called My Favorite Murder, Stay Out of the Forest. There's a reason they said that. Women really are harassed and attacked in the back country at alarming rates. But this reality infuriates my guest. And once I started thinking about it, honestly, it made me pretty mad too. But my guest today is working to make the woods a safer and more accessible place for everybody. Emphasis on everybody. Today, we are going into week 2 of our series on new true crime books. And today's book is a great one. The book is called Trailed by Kathryn Miles, and it is out on May 3rd, but you can pre-order it now. I will put a link to it in the show notes. Kathryn is an award-winning journalist, accomplished author. This is actually her 5th book. And while she's written several books before this, you're going to hear in today's interview why this one makes her the most nervous to have out in the world. And while her credentials obviously make her an excellent person to write this book, she has personal reasons as well. As an outdoor enthusiast and sexual assault survivor herself, Kathryn understands the landscape and context that are the setting to the 1996 murders of Lollie Winans and Julie Williams. And their story is the center of her book, Trailed, One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders. But this is not just a book about a cold case. This is a book asking big questions, which is why I love it, which is why we're reading it. Who owns the woods? Who is safe to enjoy wilderness? What is a hate crime? Was this a hate crime or was it a random murder? Is there a wrongful accusation and potential wrongful conviction happening? Why can't new DNA help solve this crime? Lots of questions. Kathryn has lots of answers and also really great insight on true crime, women, and all the things we really care about here. She also wants to hear what you think. She lays out a very compelling theory for who she believes committed these murders. Do you agree or disagree? I would love to hear from you if you read this book, and certainly want to hear your thoughts after listening to the conversation. Kathryn, thank you so much for killing the small talk. Good morning and welcome, Kathryn, to Dialogue Podcast. Excited to talk to you today.
I'm glad to talk to you too.
So we're talking about Trailed, One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders. And the one woman is you. And the Shenandoah Murders I had heard about. I'm surprised I didn't know more. And so your connection to the case and why you've covered it, could you talk about how you came to understand the story and the murders of Julie and Lollie, and maybe lead up to why you started writing about this?
Sure. And it's a really long story in some ways. I was a contemporary of theirs in terms of age, and like them was also a teenage sexual assault survivor, and also like them had really sort of found strength and a sort of new way to be in my body backpacking on places like the Appalachian Trail. And so in May of 1996, when they were murdered, which was my college graduation weekend, I think that like a lot of people our age, we were really shocked and frankly kind of shattered by the fact that these two strong outdoor leaders had been brutally murdered, doing what they loved the most, and also doing what they were really good and skilled at doing. And I think that, it had two effects on a lot of us. It had the effect of, being shocked and horrified that this could happen to these amazing women. But also, I think you can't help but then wonder, could it also happen to me? And so finding out about those murders and some of the other murders on the Appalachian Trail really changed my relationship with the landscape, really changed the way that I backpacked and my level of safety and perceived security on the trail. So that had always been kind of hovering around with me. I was teaching at the small college where Lollie had been a student. Obviously, I was teaching long after she had died, but I was teaching at the college in 2002 when an individual was indicted for the crime. And that, I think, really brought back a lot of very strong emotions for people. So then when the 20th anniversary of the murders came about, at that point, I was working full time as a trail correspondent for Outside Magazine. And I had pitched it as a story to my editor, thinking that it would be a fairly straightforward account of the crime, the move to indict someone and solve the crime. I thought it would be a fairly easy story. And as soon as I became involved in it, I realized there was nothing easy or clear cut about the story at all. And so it was obvious to me that I didn't need 2,000 words to tell the story. I needed 100,000 words to tell the story, and maybe even more, frankly.
So let's start with this idea that you mentioned briefly, which is adventure therapy as a tool for overcoming trauma. Makes sense now that I've read about it and hearing you talk about it, but can you talk about that in a larger sense, like what women or survivors find through that process?
Sure. And one of the things that was really interesting to me as I was working on this story is the model for a very long time, especially in this country, for access to wilderness, particularly by way of wilderness therapy or adventure programs, are things like Outward Bound or the National Outdoor Leadership School. And both of those programs, which are gold standard programs, were based on a military model that came out of World War II. And so it was a very hierarchical model. And it was also a model that was based on increasing stress, right? We're going to keep stressing you more and more and more to see how you respond to the stress. And for a lot of people who are already stressed, right, that's not the right approach. And especially for people who are, survivors of any kind of assault, sexual or otherwise, or people who just have never felt secure in a wilderness space, which I think is true for a lot of people for a variety of reasons, race, ethnicity, sexuality, differently abled, different body shapes even, are all things that I think make a lot of people feel both underrepresented and also not confident and very much an outsider in that space. So one of the things that was really revolutionary that I talk about in the book was in the 1980s, there was this real sort of reckoning about these outdoor programs. And this wonderful organization called Woods Women came to be. And it was founded by these feminist, very sort of like holistic thinkers about how to be in the wilderness. And it doesn't have to be a stress model, but in fact, it can be a much more redemptive, much more supportive model. And I think for a lot of people, this concept in Woods Women as an organization was the first time that they felt like they could be safe in this space. And it's also where Lollie and Julie met and fell in love, and where they had both found their passion. They both had plans to really, I think they were already these incredible social justice leaders. They had already done so much in the world at their very young age. But through Woods Women, they had found, I think, even more inspiration. Lollie, for instance, was going to school. Her plans after graduating was to create a similar program to Woods Women that focused specifically on sexual assault survivors and giving them a place to have that experience that I think she did, and certainly I did, which is, your body, after you're attacked, your body is this contested space. Like, you don't want anything to do with your body. And so the idea of coming to terms with that, and also finding a way to like believe in the strength of your body and want to occupy it again, is a revolutionary thing. And that's what she wanted to commit her life to.
Well, yeah. And the two of them, as young as they were, already they were leading trips for inner city women and children to campsites and recreation centers. They were already so generous in sharing their expertise with people who may not otherwise have had access, which is what makes what happened to them, which is so tragic, just all the more just agonizing, because they were working so hard to change that landscape, to open it up to more people. And then they themselves were targeted. So maybe we could talk about the crime a little bit, and also the investigation on the campsite, the trails, the mountains. Set the scene a little bit. What went wrong in those days? And another thing we learn a lot about in your book is the low solve rate of these, backcountry crimes. And so maybe talk a little bit about what's working against law enforcement and these investigations, and specifically what happened to Julie and Lollie on that day.
Sure. And by way of context, I should say, and I'm a huge fan of our national park system, of which the Appalachian Trail is a part of the national parks. I'm a huge fan. It's a wonderful resource that we all have. And really, it's something to be celebrated. But for over 20 years now, the national parks have been grossly underfunded. There's something like $3 billion of deferred maintenance at this point. And part of that deferred maintenance is infrastructure, but it's also things like radios and training for rangers and making sure we have enough rangers. And so one of the questions that I ask in the book is, are we really safe? How safe are we in places like national parks where we think, we're the most secure in the world, or maybe we're a little bit worried about bears. But by 1996, national parks in Shenandoah in particular were already running this huge deficit that was making it very difficult for authorities to police the park. So that's part of it. But it was May of 1996. Lollie and Julie are about to embark on a busy summer working. Lollie's going to be working at a summer camp. Julie's going to be doing water quality. She was a geologist by training in Vermont. So they decided they were going to take a week to kind of take a vacation, relax. They'd been working really hard on their relationship with a couples counselor who had also suggested that it would be a really good idea for them to have some uninterrupted time together. So they decided they'd go to Shenandoah. They knew that, backpacking was what had brought them together, and it was their great love together. And they also knew it was a place where Lollie's dog could also join them as
Taj.
well. Lollie's dog, Taj.
Sweet Taj, yes.
A very sweet golden retriever, yellow lab mix, who was just fiercely loyal to Lollie and also really loved Julie. So they load up Taj, they load up their backpacks and drive from Vermont down to Shenandoah, and have a fairly sort of, by backpacker standards, a fairly easy trip planned, right? It wasn't about the mileage. It wasn't about summiting. It was about being together. It was about being in the wilderness. And because of their journals and because of the photographs that Lollie was taking, we can recreate some of their trip. But what I think is really important to point out is this is where their expertise really comes into play. They really were wilderness experts and they knew the rules. And when I was talking to rangers who had encountered them, the rangers were so impressed by Lollie and Julie's ability to sort of recite the backcountry rules, right? Don't camp within, X number of yards of the trail. Here's what you do with your brown and your gray water. Here's how you leave no trace. Here's how you don't call attention to yourself. They really were doing everything right. And so what is remarkable to me is that on what was their last night, and we still don't know exactly what night that is, but we think it's May 24th, 1996, they had found a backcountry campsite. And I should say, for people who aren't familiar, this is not like car camping, KOA camping, right? There's no actual site with a fire pit and a picnic table. And so they had gone down this very almost hidden trail that had at one point been a horse trail. It's called the Bridle Trail, but had kind of fallen into disuse. And so they had found this trail, which isn't even on a lot of maps. They had hiked about a third of a mile down the trail, and then they had bushwhacked easily 100 yards through the underbrush and had found this very secret campsite next to the stream. It's a beautiful space, but it's a hidden space. And in fact, if you were coming down the trail, you couldn't even see it. The only way you could see it is if you were coming up the trail. And I've been there, I don't know how many times at this point, and I still walk by it all of the time. And when I first visited, I was very nervous about visiting the trail. I had gone with some of the FBI agents and some of the National Park Service law enforcement rangers. And I was really apprehensive about what it was to very deliberately go to a place where I knew that this sort of unimaginably brutal murder had taken place. Yeah. I was freaked out, is it going to be spooky? Is it going to be whatever? And as I say in the book, what struck me immediately was how beautiful it was, how, if I had found that campsite, I would have thought I was the luckiest backpacker in the world. And it is a very beautiful place. And one of the things I also say in the book is, maybe part of why it's a beautiful place is, yes, this terrible thing happened here, but it's also the last place of these two beautiful humans. And so maybe in addition to the violence, some of what was so gorgeous and giving about them remains in the space as well.
I remember reading that exact moment and it was incredibly profound. Sometimes talking about victims can be really hard in true crime storytelling because you want to honor the dead, of course. And we would never victim shame, and there's no reason to in this story. there's no reason to ever. But also the language can sometimes just feel trite or incomplete or one-dimensional. And you really give color to these two women and to an environment to where they feel like fully fleshed out people as best as we could know them. So I really appreciated that. Even some of your descriptions of them, they're honest, fiercely loyal, but sometimes a pain in the ass, and I'm sure you got that from one of their friends, which like who among us wouldn't be described that way by one of our friends at some point, right? So I love that feeling of like their essence kind of infusing that space. And that's what you're picking up on there as a possibility. So they go missing. One of their former roommates is trying to get in touch with them to coordinate logistics around an upcoming move. And when he can't, he reaches out to Julie's parents.
Correct. So it's the end of May now. It's the final days of May. They're moving out of their apartment. Julie and her roommate are moving out of their apartment. And she's profoundly reliable as a human. As
Right.
someone who also grew up in the Midwest, I understand, we're just bred to never be tardy, right? If you're 10 minutes early, you're still late, so Julie was, beyond reliable. And so she hadn't shown up to finish packing up the apartment. Her roommate knew this was highly irregular. And so he calls her parents. And as her parents, told me, that at first he was pissed,
Sure.
to use Julie's dad's word, he was like, where is she? We're supposed to be cleaning out the apartment. And at first her parents, Tom and Patsy, they think, well, I'm sure there's an explanation. By this point, Julie's done missionary work in South America. She's done geological work in Europe. She's done all of this backcountry work on tribal lands in northern Minnesota. So it's not unusual for them to not hear from her for a week because she's often in these remote places. But as the night goes on, they think to themselves, wait, no, this is actually different, right? This doesn't feel right to us. And so then they have this challenge of, well, what do we do? Right? The Shenandoah is this long, thin park. It travels through, I can't remember, something like 5-7 different counties. They call the park office and they get an answering machine as the park is closed. They don't know who to call. So they call the state police. The state police says, this is not our jurisdiction. And this will be part of the problem later on, right? Is whose jurisdiction is this? Who is policing this? So the next morning they get a hold of a ranger. Rangers are very accustomed to these calls. People don't show up all of the time. And so they start what they call, in their words, a bastard search. And what they mean by it is, where is the bastard, right? Because it's almost always the person left the park and forgot to tell someone. The person's up at the bar having a beer. The person, 99.9% of the time, the person turns up and just had kind of flaked out and forgotten to tell someone that. So they do a few searches. They're talking to friends and family. They're trying to get a read on Lollie and Julie and to what degree they should be concerned. And again and again and again, friends are saying, Lollie and Julie they're not late. They don't change plans without talking. They're not irresponsible. They're the opposite. They're the most responsible humans. So the search kind of escalates a little bit. They find out that Julie now is late for her first day at this job that she was so excited about. And so now it's starting to feel a little bit more urgent. And then on a Saturday afternoon, somebody reports that there's a yellow lab golden retriever mix in a parking lot. And the rangers come, they find the dog. The dog seems scared. The dog seems agitated. The dog seems hungry. And on a whim, the ranger says, hey, Taj. And the dog immediately jumps up in his truck. So now they know they have Lollie and Julie's dog. And at that point, as the rangers that I talked to said to me, everybody's heart just broke because they'd still been hoping that Lollie and Julie were alive or fine. But the fact that now their dog is there alone says to everyone something catastrophic has happened. And at that point, they were hoping, as strange as it sounds, they were hoping that it had been a terrible accident. They were hoping that it had been a drug overdose. These were rangers who loved this park as much as they loved their families. And they were hoping that it had to have been anything other than some kind of violence in this place that they live. So then the story gets a little quirky and suspicious. And one of the things that I really wanted the readers to be able to do was to be able to kind of try to solve the case themselves. And so I try to lay everything out as objectively as I can. But one of the things that's always stuck with me is how the women's bodies were eventually found. The ranger in charge of this trail, this was part of her patrol, had walked by the campsite repeated times, hadn't seen the tent. Then, it's dark, right? And this ranger just sort of miraculously finds the tent, which I have personally always found a little suspicious. And he incidentally is one of two people who refused to talk to me for the book. So I lay all of this out because, again, I want readers to be able to come to their own conclusions. So they find the tent. It is obvious that something terrible has happened. But what becomes, I think, really shameful and unforgivable is this all gets reported to the park administration. The park administration decides to hide this information for 72 hours. At first, they say, well, maybe it was a bear attack, even though both women were zipped up in their sleeping bags, right? The women are bound and gagged and they're zipped up in their sleeping bags. And they say, well, maybe it was a bear attack. And then they say, well, maybe it was a murder-suicide, as if you could somehow tie your hands behind your own back and, very brutally slit your own throat. It's ridiculous. And so for a variety of reasons that are not excusable, but I think are mostly to do with sort of public facing image, it's Memorial Day weekend, one of the busiest weekends in the park, and the administration decides that they will hide from millions of visitors that there's been a brutal double murder and there's possibly a murderer in the park.
Hey everyone, Rebecca here. It's that time again. We are gearing up for CrimeCon 2022. This year, the event will be held in Las Vegas, and the dates are April 29th to May 1st. I am already hard at work prepping my table for Podcast Row, and I'm involved in a couple of other exciting aspects of the event, and I really hope to see you there. Now, if you use the code DIALOGUE, that's DIEALOGUE, you'll get 10% off your regular standard pass. So go to crimecon.com to register, and again, use this code DIALOGUE, DIEALOGUE, for 10% off your pass. I hope to see you in Vegas.
Hi everyone, it's Elise from True Crime Cat Lawyer. That's right, I've combined my 3 favorite things into a podcast: cats, true crime, and lawyering. Every other Thursday, my co-host Winston and I bring you a new case from the Pacific Northwest. Winston is my sassy sidekick with a mustache who can often be found donning a bow tie. In other words, she's my cat. Winston and I are passionate about true crime, and we love doing this podcast. As of this recording, we've released over 30 regular episodes and a few bonus episodes. Our episodes are focused on the victims and sharing their stories, something we take a lot of pride in. We're working hard to produce true crime content in an ethical way. Plus, every quarter, Winston and I donate our ad proceeds and Patreon proceeds to a true crime or animal-related nonprofit organization. If you're from the Pacific Northwest or you just enjoyed true crime, Winston and I would love for you to check out our show. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and Good Pods. We hope you'll join us for some true crime in the Pacific Northwest.
When you say it like that, you can understand their reaction. Like, we have to make sure this gets out. Like, all these kids and families are about to come in. However, if what they probably suspect is true, they absolutely do need to put that out there. I mean, obviously nobody knows where this person is. It is maddening. And 72 hours, as any listener will know, and you know, is a very long time in an investigation. Crucial amount of time, for any delay of misinformation to be out there is thwarting an investigation. So at this point, are their parents on site?
Julie's father, who's still alive and is a retired funeral home director, he as soon as he gets word that the campsite has been found, he immediately hops on a plane and rents a car, and he's there. And he's an incredible human. And I think the fact that in addition to being an incredible human, someone whose religious faith is very important to him. He's very open about how important Catholicism is to him. And then also someone who has this lifelong experience dealing with death, I think uniquely situated him to kind of be an emotional superhero in all of this. Lollie was estranged from her family. She was an incest survivor. And so her relationship with her family was very tricky. And her parents, who were divorced, really struggled with how to make sense of all of this. So they were largely absent and I think just emotionally overwhelmed by all of it. The national parks are the joint purview of the FBI and the National Park Service.
Right.
The National Park Service has two types of rangers: interpretive rangers, which is what we all mostly think of, right? The people in the hats who are telling us about trees and taking us on nature walks and telling us, to be quiet after 10 o'clock. And then they also have a law enforcement strand of the rangers as well, who basically have all of the jurisdictional rights as a state police officer does.
Okay.
So we have the law enforcement rangers who know this park inside and out, and they have an idea about how they want to investigate this crime.
Right.
We have the FBI trained largely to investigate urban crimes.
Right.
And so there's this culture clash from the start about how are we going to investigate this? What are we going to do with evidence? And it's maddening. And I think it will be endlessly frustrating to readers to see how much evidence, like good DNA evidence and things, most likely got lost because of this culture clash.
Infuriating. I mean, there's no excuse. And we see this a lot in cases when two different jurisdictions can't agree on how to play nicely together and work together. And only, the victims suffer and their families, and justice is slowed down and the whole thing. So how do they hone in on their person of interest, their number one suspect?
So initially it is the fog of war, and they're tracing every possible lead. They are able to figure out by way of license plates who was in the park that weekend. And they find a disturbing number of sex offenders.
Good Lord.
People with felony convictions, escaped convicts, which really, I think, calls into question, again, who we're with when we're in the national parks. So they track down all of those leads. At one point, rangers start to suspect one another. There's one ranger in particular there were four rangers actually who were present during a very similar crime that had occurred 10 years earlier on a nearby National Park Service property called the Colonial Parkway. There were 8 Colonial Parkway murders altogether. They spanned from about 1986 to about 1988. People had always suspected that it might have been a law enforcement officer or someone acting as a law enforcement officer, because when the victims were found, they would have their driver's side window rolled down often and like their ID out. Yeah. So that was one speculation. So because 4 of those rangers were now at Shenandoah, and now 10 years later, we have a very similar crime. The rangers start to suspect each other. The FBI starts to suspect the rangers. This goes on for a year, basically, and there are no good leads. And it looks like the case is going to grow cold. Everyone is insanely frustrated. Meanwhile, these other murders of women are happening in the area, in this very rural, sparsely populated area that has historically had very little violent crime. And then in July of 1997, this young man named Darryl David Rice, who suffers from mental illness, bipolar schizophrenic, is having a sort of bipolar schizophrenic episode in the park. He's been up for 2 days. He's unraveling emotionally. He goes to the park. He's been up for about 2 or 3 days straight. At this point, he's been smoking a fair amount of weed by his own admission. And he's driving through the park on a July afternoon, and he accosts the woman who is cycling on the main road, which is called Skyline Drive in the park. And he drives by her a couple of times. He shouts some threatening and offensive things. He throws a Pepsi bottle at her. He runs her off the road, and he says, "I'm going to get you." And again, this is not okay behavior, right? This is threatening, assaultive behavior. I want to say that clearly. It is not murderous behavior, in my opinion. So she gets away. She calls the authorities. the Rangers immediately think, this is the guy. This is the guy who killed Lollie and Julie a year earlier. So they apprehend him, and they are sort of preternaturally interested in what he knows about what occurred in May of 1996. So he's arrested for the cyclist assault, but that's really just sort of a stopgap, because they're convinced at that point that he is also the murderer. And he was the person who was then eventually indicted in 2002.
What time of day was the cyclist attack? Presumably that was daytime that she was biking?
It was late morning. Okay. And she was cycling in broad daylight. And the thing that I think that has always stuck with me and has stuck with the all of the forensic psychologists, former FBI profilers and everyone else who I've talked to, is everything about that attack on the cyclist is unplanned, unhinged, not sophisticated, and again, I'm not trying to excuse Darryl Rice's behavior. I'm sure it was a terrifying event.
Oh, for sure.
But what we know about the murder of Lollie and Julie is that it was incredibly sophisticated. Someone managed to subdue two very strong, very backcountry experienced women. This person, bound and gagged them. This person brutally murdered them. This person left hardly a trace, right? It was an incredibly sophisticated, planned murder. And what everyone has told me was undoubtedly not the person's first murder. And so for me, what has never made sense is how you square that with Darryl Rice, who by his own admission and by the admission of the investigators was a complete and total train wreck,
Yes.
So, but they fixate on him. And one of the things I talk a lot about in the book is confirmation bias, and what it is when we commit to something being true, we will go to any extent to prove to ourselves that it is true. And I include myself in this. I'm not immune from this by any stretch. But I really do think that that's what happened, was that, was Darryl Rice a viable suspect? Possibly. Should he have been investigated? Completely. But, as I outline in the book, again and again and again, DNA evidence, circumstantial evidence is ruling him out, and investigators insist on ruling him in.
So what was the clinching piece of evidence that they were able to get the conviction with him? Like, why do you think he went down for it?
Yeah, and I should say, so this is really an important point from a criminal justice and from frankly a social justice perspective. So he was indicted, he was arraigned. John Ashcroft, who was then the Attorney General for the United States, makes this very public announcement and this very strange conflation between September 11th and the murder of Lollie and Julie, and that by putting Darryl Rice to death, we're going to somehow, as a country, heal from September 11th. And the only evidence they have is highly circumstantial. He was in the park the days surrounding the murder, which he was often in the park. His father lived about 20 miles away, and he was an avid cyclist. And so he was often in the park, and he was in the park around the time of the murder. We do know that. The only other piece of evidence that at all links Darryl Rice is this very bizarre phone call, which became just the absolute center and the linchpin of this case. So a few days after the murder, Darryl Rice, who's back home in coastal Maryland, smoking weed again, makes this phone call. And Darryl Rice continues to be a huge Grateful Dead follower. So, this is 1996, right? This is mostly before the internet. I mean, the internet exists, but we're not Googling things like we do now. So at the time, there was a 1-800 number and a non-toll-free number that was the Grateful Dead hotline, right? Which deadheads would call to find out about what upcoming shows were happening and things like that. Darryl Rice makes this phone call to a place in San Francisco, which is called the Spectrum Center, and it's an LGBTQ center. Its director is a woman named Janie Spar, noted theorist, noted advocate for gay issues, the author of the editor of this book about religion and sexuality and coming out as a gay Presbyterian. Mm-hmm. Julie had read that book in the fall. And so Darryl Rice calls the Spectrum Center, where Janie Spar is the director. And in the minds of the law enforcement officers, the fact that Julie had written down the name of a book by Jamie Sparr and that Darryl Rice had called a phone number associated with Jamie Sparr was the connection they needed. What Darryl Rice and his attorneys argued is the first 6 numbers of Jamie Sparr's telephone number are the first 6 numbers of the Grateful Dead hotline. And the last 4 numbers are the last 4 numbers of Darryl Rice's office where he works. He's high. He conflates the 2 numbers.
Yeah, I didn't mean to laugh, but it is almost comical. That to me is a viable explanation, or could be a very compelling, reasonable doubt situation. If that was their primary source of evidence, that feels very not ironclad to me.
And what I should say, just to close the loop, because I think this is really important, is after the DNA evidence comes back and repeatedly appears to rule out Darryl Rice, the prosecution is faced with the fact that they really only have this phone call. And so in the days leading up to jury trial, what the prosecution decides to do is dismiss the case without prejudice. And what that means is that Darryl Rice can be brought back to trial at any point, right? He doesn't need to be reindicted. He doesn't need to be rearranged or anything else like that. They can go right back to the trial. And so he, I believe, is the only, or maybe there's one other person who's currently existing in America in this state of what is ultimately double jeopardy. And again, I can't say for certain whether or not Darryl Rice did it, but it is true that, I mean, Darryl Rice is constantly haunted by the idea that the authorities are still completely committed to the belief that he did it. And they are just waiting for that one more next thing so that they can actually start the trial.
Oh man, if he didn't do it, what a horrible way to live. And I remember this part because I wrote down the Latin term for what you just said with the salvus erubis. Like that was a new one for me. So I love learning a new term. That's without prejudice is what that means. So now cut to 2016-ish, I think, when you're working on this story and the FBI issues this statement again about looking for help to secure a conviction for the murders of Julie and Lollie. So all this time has passed. They're still obviously holding him in that like seat of interest where they could go after him, but they're reopening it to the public. And you found their verbiage to be a little bit interesting. Can you talk about that?
Right. They were very clear that they were not looking for information leading to the arrest and indictment, which is the sort of textbook boilerplate language that they use. And when I was talking to the head of the investigation, he kept saying, let me be very clear here. No one has been exonerated. And the undertone seemed very clearly to be, we think it's Darryl Rice. We just don't have quite enough. And the FBI and the federal government spent millions and millions of dollars. They took their number one counter-terrorist undercover agent and embedded him in a cell with Darryl Rice. They fabricated issues of the Washington Post. They sent fake letters that looked like they were from Europe. Untold resources went to trying to get Darryl Rice to confess. They, in my opinion, egregiously doctored a recording they have of an informant who was wearing a wire. And in the arraignment and in what John Ashcroft says, John Ashcroft repeatedly says, this was a hate crime. Darryl Rice targeted these women because they were lesbians. He said, I hate gays. And I partnered with the Innocence Project working on this book to reinvestigate the case. And as we were doing that, we found the actual transcript of the recording in which Darryl Rice says, I'm so mad. They keep trying to get me to say that I hate gays.
Oh my
And they
gosh.
snitched that, and I think that this happens more than we want to admit. That again, operating under confirmation bias, investigators who are supposed to be solving these cases get so wrapped up in their attempt to pin it on one person that they basically, in my opinion, let a known serial killer go free and ultimately commit multiple other crimes because they were so fixated on Darryl Rice.
Right. I don't know how to say this, but the leveraging this as a hate crime when it might have been, but using that, platform as these were gay victims, this was a hate crime to then sort of manipulate justice to put it on potentially the wrong person is so frustrating, because in so many cases, the LGBTQ status of a victim doesn't matter or is completely disregarded, or it's like it was convenient for them to use that narrative and to push it to make this fit as a theory. And that's frustrating to me, because in so many cases, I feel like it isn't taken into consideration, or it's lower on the priority list when it's a factor. So that's like doubly frustrating.
What Lollie and Julie's family and friends will tell you is that the women were completely politicized. And, everybody's been very clear, including Julie's parents, that, their sexuality was not an issue for them. Julie's parents have been very honest that, they knew Lollie. They sort of suspected they were more than friends. They were like, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's cool. Julie was struggling to come out, but there would have been a warm reception had Julie had come out. But both families found out that the two women identified as lesbians, or in Julie's case, probably more bisexual. They were publicly outed by a woman who was Julie's pastor in Vermont. And they were publicly outed in the national news. Julie's parents found out an hour before her funeral, because one of his brothers had come in with a copy of, the Chicago Tribune or something like that. And the top story was, Shenandoah murder victims were lesbian lovers, and so the family is rightfully angry and wary at the ways in which their daughters have been politicized and used to ends that seem to be completely irrelevant to their own personal story and to their own personal quest for justice too.
Yeah. So I can't imagine you as an outdoors lover and a person who, I think what I discovered reading this was that I would be considered a day tripper, which means you guys hate me. I'm the person that goes hiking like for the day.
We just don't understand why you're so cheerful all the time, because we're miserable.
Maybe I need to like go more deeply into the hobby, and maybe I would, move over to the other side and not be so hated on the trails. But, you obviously wouldn't want to discourage women from exploring the outdoors. And yet the facts are kind of sobering, and we've obviously touched on them, but the rates of violence against women in these settings, these national parks and these mountains and in camping areas, how do you reconcile that?
It's such an important question. And, in addition to wanting justice for Lollie and Julie and wanting this case closed, my other real aim for this book is to really maybe force a national reckoning about safety in the wilderness and who we are in wilderness spaces. And it's incredibly distressing to me already. The book isn't out yet, but I've done some advanced, speaking engagements and things like that. And it's really upsetting to me how many people, straight, non-binary, lesbian women have come up to me and said, I remember this crime and I have never gone back to the woods, or I remember this crime and I won't hike alone anymore. And that's not fair, and it's not right. And it makes me incredibly angry that, people of color, Muslim people, people of different gender orientation, sexual orientation, and like I said earlier, even people just differently sized bodies don't feel safe in the wilderness. And that's not fair. And that makes me so angry. And that's where I feel like I start to turn from journalist to advocate, because I want to stand up and like stomp around, and like shout and pound my fist and say, like, this has to be fixed, right? We have to have equal access to these beautiful places. Everyone deserves to enjoy these beautiful places. The wilderness is a wonderful, wonderful place. Like, there's so much to be gained on so many different levels from having time there. But too many people feel like they're barred from entering it. And I want that to change.
Any ideas how? Like, how,
well, one of the things I talk about in the book is representation, right?
Yes.
The leading outdoor magazines, the leading outdoor publications, TV shows and things, represent one type of person, right? It's a white, very fit person who's also incidentally is usually male, and there's been studies that, women, even like white fit women, are generally depicted in ads and things like holding a marshmallow fork that's, you know, or carrying gear to the car. Whereas, you know, it's overwhelmingly white men depicted enjoying the wilderness, right? So if you're a brown person, if you're a Black person, if you're, you know, a fat person, if you're a person with one arm, if you're, I mean, I could keep going, right? But you don't see yourself in these ads. And so you think this place isn't for me. And, you know, we still allow bad behavior to occur. You know, I am really distressed by the number of thru hikers on the Appalachian Trail who talk about feeling harassed, like unwanted sexual attention, things like that. And so as a country, we have got to sort of start addressing this and making sure that we are actually creating space for marginalized people to have a safe and rewarding experience in the backcountry.
What about true crime itself as the genre? You talk a little bit about, I don't know if I would call it reluctance, but it seems like you're a consumer of the genre. Where do you see Trailed fitting in the true crime landscape? And how do you think about true crime as a woman and the way true crime storytelling is happening?
Yeah, that is such a complicated question. Look, I like a lot of people, and I think a lot of women, I definitely have an interest in true crime. And I think it's multiple things, right? It's a safe place for us to explore fear, right? Yes. I think we all are interested in the psychology of why people do terrible things. A lot of people I talk to who are very active in true crime circles told me that they feel really empowered being a part of it. And they feel like the more they watch true crime or participate in discussion boards, the more they feel both empowered. And they also feel safer and more prepared because they feel like they better understand how these crimes happen. And all of that makes perfect sense to me. So I think in that regard, you know, Trail does fit in there. But as you said earlier, you brought up a really important point. And I think we really have to ask ourselves, like, what are we doing to the subjectivity of the people involved in these crimes, right? I think too often the victims, their stories are not told. They're just a sort of blurred out body or a chalk outline or a blood splatter, and we forget the humanity. And, you know, one of the things that I'm painfully aware of too is, you know, Lollie and Julie's family and friends are still alive. They've been very supportive of this book, but they're also nervous about this book. They know it's going to raise a lot of pain for them. It's going to bring stories back that are very hard for them to deal with. And I think sometimes as consumers of true crime, we forget about that emotional side. We forget about the people who are still grieving, who are still fearful, who are still processing what was, you know, unimaginable tragedy. And I think that we have to be respectful of that. And I think that we have to foreground that and not just get lost in the like kind of obsessive interest in serial murders and why they kill and things like that. I think we also have to be reminded of their victims and the people that they leave behind.
100%. So well said. You clearly have the support of their families and friends. What would you have done hypothetically if they'd asked you not to write this book?
I wouldn't have written it.
Wow.
Flat out not written it. I didn't do a single thing on the book until I had the express permission. It was really important to me that I not do more harm to their families. And it was really, I knew that I couldn't tell the love story of Lollie and Julie, which is such a great love story, right? Two amazing, beautiful humans who fall in love in the wilderness. It's a great story.
It is.
But I wasn't going to be able to tell that story if their closest friends and family didn't trust me with that story. Yeah. And so that was really important to me as well.
I think your response is rare, and it's really, really refreshing and encouraging. And I wish more creators and authors and journalists would consider that at the start of their projects. And obviously you have to build that trust and you have to earn that trust. And you did. How did you then reconcile getting the unique access you did to some of their private writings and photos? Like, how do you start thinking about ways to use those in the story that honors them and doesn't exploit them?
And that's really hard. I'm still nervous about that. Like, the one thing about this book that makes me nervous is people feeling like, people accusing me of trying to appropriate their stories or not keeping their privacy private. And so I tried to make very deliberate decisions that I felt like wouldn't betray their sense of confidentiality and would explain certain things. Like, for instance, Julie really struggled with coming out to her family, and I felt like it was important to show that because to understand the impact of her being publicly outed, you need to understand, how surprising it was to her family, and also how gracious her family, would have been. And so to tell that story, I do have to get a little personal. I think to understand why this trip was so important to Lollie and Julie, you have to understand that, their relationship had been bumpy, and they were trying to figure out how to come to their own individual terms with their individual sexuality. And they also were trying to come to terms with what is it to be, a queer couple in a decade that is not open, right, to that. And so I think to understand that, I do feel like I have to show parts of their inner selves as well too. And yeah, the one thing that absolutely keeps me up at night is, would they be okay with that? And it's a question that haunts me. And I hope I was respectful, and I hope I made the right choices, and I will absolutely be the first person to apologize and make amends as best as I can if I didn't make the right choices.
How about the status of the case right now? Is there anything new happening, and how closely connected are you to the figures still involved?
So far as I know, nothing is happening with the case right now. The FBI believes they have their person. I believe, and as I lay out in the book, and I would be so grateful to hear listeners' thoughts about whether they think I got it right or not. I lay out a case for another person who I strongly believe committed this crime and committed other crimes that still have not been solved. And it's eminently solvable. What's so frustrating to me is that this person's DNA has not been excluded from the crime scene. We can retest it using more sophisticated diagnostic tools right now and solve this once and for all. And I have forensic experts. I have a professor at the University of California who regularly works with the FBI. He's developed new, even more sophisticated testing that can use the DNA in hair. And he's like, look, all I need is a centimeter of hair and we will solve this once and for all. And the DNA and the FBI has not agreed. I've offered to pay for these tests, and the FBI.
What is the resistance?
I think that a few things. I think for so long they've believed that it's Darryl Rice. And I think that because this was such a high profile case, and because it was the first federal hate crime case, because these bizarre associations with September 11th were made, I think maybe there's a pride issue happening too. Like, we can't back down. We can't say we were wrong.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah. And like I said, because of this, the person that I believe did this continued to commit crimes until 2002, 2003. And that, I think, is where this all gets incredibly dangerous, right? And this happened in other cases as well too. And that's another reckoning that we all need here is how are we failing victims because of the way we're investigating things?
Well, Kathryn, this was such a great conversation. It's such an amazing book. I can't wait to hear what listeners think. And I do want to hear their theories. I do want to hear if they agree, disagree. They're smart. They're very thoughtful. And I'm very excited to hear what they think. So thank you so much for killing the small talk. Best of luck with the book launch.
And thank you for the attention to this case. I'm really grateful.
Dialogue is a Yellow Tape Media production, audio engineered by Jason Usry and produced, hosted, and edited by me, Rebecca Sebastian. If you love the podcast, please consider becoming a diehard by signing up at patreon.com/dialogue. Other ways to support the show? Follow along on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across platforms, and you can now watch most episodes on YouTube by subscribing to my channel, Rebecca Sebastian. For more information or to drop me a note, visit RebeccaSebastian.com. Until next time, thank you for listening and killing the small talk.